All right. So when you don't know how you're going to pay the bills, what do you think? Or what do you do? You may have been in that position. Usually, young couples are there. College students are sometimes there. Right after college, you're there. Sometimes during the middle of life, you're there. So what we have in Second Kings 4 is a pretty desperate situation financially. At the beginning, and at the end of Second Kings 4. In the middle is a wealthy woman, if you see that in verse 8. So there's two different stories here in Second Kings, two different categories, I'd say, of people that have needs. And so we're going to just look at those who have financial needs first. And then we're expecting, as we're ramping up and transitioning from Elijah to Elisha, we're expecting Elisha to, with God's help, be able to meet these needs miraculously. He is he is the next great prophet. And remember, we have in the back of our mind, he's got a double portion of Elijah's spirit, and we're not sure exactly what that meant whenever he was first given that or promised that. But what we're seeing now is that it's being played out. So what Elijah was able to do, Elisha's able to do, let's say even more, okay, miraculously, so to speak. So it is clear whenever God performs miracles that he is behind this person, and he is speaking. He's trying to get people's attention. And when it comes to God-fearers, he's trying to encourage them and build their faith. So if we are surrounded by Baal-fearers, like we saw last week, Chemosh or other wicked idols, fearers. When you have a God-fearing small minority of people, you feel surrounded and you're like, are we really serving the right God? Like there are so many other gods around us. And when we're in New England in 2024, and everyone around us seems to be serving other gods, and we're one of the only ones that come to church on Sunday. We're in a Wednesday Bible study now. We're the only ones, some of the only people that are going to a Bible study on midweek and having a prayer time. Why do we do that? Hopefully because you're God-fearing. And I mentioned God-fearing because we'll see that. And I'm going to end with a psalm, reading a psalm that hopefully will encourage us, because these stories are pretty much straightforward. There's not a lot of unique details here as we read the stories. Remember from Sunday, Romans 15:4, that how these stories, in reading them, should encourage us to endure and by that have hope. Okay, so encouragement and endurance and have hope. And if you can read the Old Testament stories with those three things in mind, you'll see them over and over and over again, and how we are living in the New Testament on this side of Christ, but still we can draw great encouragement and endurance and hope from these Old Testament stories. So what we're going to do is look at verses 1 to 7 and then 38 to 44, all in chapter 4. And Lord willing, next week we'll look at the two stories, a couple, maybe a decade apart, of the Shunammite woman. And so we'll put her two stories together next week. All right, so when you lack resources, this passage, these type of passages will help your line of thinking. Remember, we have to put off the old man, renew our minds, and put on the new man. And so these stories are here to strengthen your faith in the one who alone gives the best encouragement, the best endurance, and the best hope. It's our responsibility to fear God and trust him. And then it's God's responsibility to provide what we need. Okay, so let's look at verse 1. Now, the wife of one of the sons of the prophets. So we don't know exactly how many sons of the prophets there are. We see categories of them. We see a group of 50 of them in chapter 2. We see a group of 100 of them at the end of this story. So there is the wife, and so they're not, some would say the sons of the prophets were kind of like monks or in monasteries. But that's not the case because they're married, and this guy was married and had two kids. Okay, so probably similar to pastors today. The wife of one of the sons of the prophets cried to Elisha, your servant, my husband, is dead. You know that your servant feared the Lord, but the creditor has come to take my two children to be his slaves. That's all chapter 1. So there's a great financial need for a God-fearing widow who goes, where does she go? She goes to the God-empowered prophet. Okay. And so Leviticus 25:39 to 41 says that if you couldn't pay your bills, you could sell yourself or put yourself into slavery. And so knowing Leviticus 25 says, okay, well, this creditor, the guy who has the mortgage maybe for this house, is coming to take this widow's two sons now. If she only has two sons, assuming that they are younger, because if they're older, then they should be working and providing for the house. But if they're younger, they probably are maybe too young to have jobs. Kind of like if you have an 8, 10-year-old or 11 and 12-year-old, right now, my kids want to get jobs, but they have to wait till they're 14. All right. So a 13-year-old can't really provide for their house. Little jobs here and there, right? But they can't go out and get a job and support themselves. So these boys are probably young, but they're old enough to help their mom do what is going to be expected of her, but too young to go out and work. However, the guy who has the mortgage says, "Well, these boys, as they grow up, they're gonna come be a slave for me. He's gonna take them out of the house, and as they get older, they're gonna provide financially for him, pay the bills of the house, and then if they were to follow the year of Jubilee, which is every 50 years, they would go back free from slavery and go back to their mom. But we don't know where this is at. It could be years and years that these boys would be in slavery. And so this is a great financial need here. This woman we feel bad for her. She's already lost her husband. Now she's about ready to lose her house or lose her two sons. And so all bad, a bad decision or bad outcomes. And so she goes to Elisha, and Elisha says to her in verse 2, what shall I do for you? It's not like um, he's not mocking her, or he's just okay. So let's try to figure this out. He says, so tell me, trying to get what she has. What do you have in your house? And she looks around. She says, okay, your servant has nothing. I mean, they are very, very poor. Has nothing in the house except a jar of oil. That's all I have. A jar of oil. That's anything of value, and it's probably a small jar. This could be olive oil to cook with, or it could be more refined oil that you could use for cooking or lighting your house and lamps. You remember the parable of the 10 virgins that had oil that they had, and they had to go buy oil, some of them. So they had oil lamps and oil likely for cooking. So it was a valuable resource. She doesn't have a lot of it, though. I remember Elijah's story where that lady only had a little bit of oil and a little bit of meal to and then there she's going to make a cake and die. This similar story here, verse 3. So then he says, okay, go out. Here's God's plan for you to provide for you. Go outside, borrow vessels from all your neighbors, empty vessels, and not too few. So she has work to do. Now, these are able-bodied widow, and likely it sounds like her boys are going to be involved in this too. So they're going out, and if God gives you something to do, kind of like when the Israelites have to collect manna, when they had to go out and collect it, their faith is being built every single day. As they go out and collect manna, they're like, God provided this for us, but it's our job to go out and get it. We're not going to stay in our tent. It wasn't like a funnel on top of their tent that God just dropped the manna right into their tent. They didn't have to go out and work for it. And so he says, okay, you're going to work for this, and God's going to provide miraculously for you. And so as God gives them something to do, their faith is growing. And you can imagine these little boys, let's say they're 8 and 10. Their mom says, okay, Dad taught us to fear God. Your dad did. And God would provide. And you knew maybe Elisha, Dad knew Elijah. Now Elisha's taken his place. And so when we're in desperate need, we're going to go to God, and we'll see how he's going to provide for us. Okay. And so this family, young family here, the widow, the two sons, they go out and they are collecting, borrowing vessels. And you can imagine that maybe their house is maybe the size of this room here, and it's just full of empty vessels. And one little pot or one little jar of oil. Okay. And let's see what Elisha says. All right. So when you go out and borrow, but don't borrow too few. Like get as many as you can. So their house is full of vessels. Then go in and shut the door. This is a private miracle. And many times Jesus performs private miracles to build very precise faith in just a few people. And here he says, shut the door behind yourself, you and your sons, and pour into these vessels. And when one is full, set it aside. Now, if you've ever done science experiments, you maybe can divide liquid between two or three vessels, but you never have more liquid than you start with, okay? Except when God's behind it, okay? And this is how God's going to provide miraculously. And these little boys, if they're 8 and 10 years old, they know how science works as well. They're expecting this little jar is going to run out. It doesn't run out. It doesn't run out. It doesn't run out. It doesn't run out. And they're filling bigger jars than their initial jar. And they're not filling one or two or five or 10 or 20, maybe 100, maybe 200. Okay. I say that because of how much money they're going to get from this. This is a massive amount of money that God's providing for them from this one jar of oil. And these boys, their faith is growing in the true God. They're probably learning to fear God as they're watching his power for them. The wife, as she's watching God's power for her faith is growing. She is really glad she married this guy who was a God-fearer. Right? Verse 5 continues, they shut the door, and as they poured, they brought the vessels to her. And when the vessels were full, she said to her son, bring me another vessel. Imagine this, the excitement is growing, like, bring me another one, bring me another one. Like, this is unreal. It's like your mind is blown. And he said to her, so one of the sons says, there's not another. And then the oil stopped flowing. And she came and told the man of God. Now the door is shut. Nobody knows why they borrowed these vessels. Nobody knows how many they have in this house, except the boys and the mom. And I don't know how long this took. It may have taken all afternoon, and this is the most exciting afternoon of their lives. And she says, okay, so she comes to the man of God and says, what do I do now? And he says, go, sell the oil, pay your debts. You and your sons can live on the rest. So let's say that today she has a $200,000 mortgage, 300,000. She has that much money of oil, plus she has enough to live on. I mean, that is a significant amount of money that God provided for her. That's why I say it wasn't a few vessels. It wasn't just a few. I mean, she had hundreds, likely, of vessels. As she sold the oil, she probably delivered the vessels back. Hey, thanks for letting us use your oil vessels. And these little guys, their faith their faith has grown. There is one true God. Elisha is his prophet. Well, let's skip down. And you can compare that if you read verse 8 with the wealthy woman from Shunem. And Shunem was near Nazareth, south of the Sea of Galilee. So we'll get her story, and her need is different. She doesn't need money because she's wealthy, but her need is different in verses 8 to 37. We'll get that next week. So let's skip down to verse 38 because, again, we go back to poverty with the sons of the prophets. So verse 38, if you're sons of the prophets, you're also God-fearers because this is to be the prophet of the living God during this time. You'd be unique. You'd be very few and far between, and be known for fearing God, which we saw back in verse 1. So verse 38, Elisha came to Gilgal. Remember, that's the place where he starts. It's just north of Jericho. It's where he starts on the Elijah's last day on earth. And so this is one of Elisha's hubs. When there was a famine in the land, you'll see in chapter 8 that there was a famine in the land. And when there is corruption in leadership with the kings, Ahab and Ahab's sons, God often sent famine. And this is likely this same famine. It could be the same famine of chapter 8 that we'll see in a couple more chapters here. And so during the famine, as the sons of the prophets were sitting before him, he said to his servant, "Set on a large pot and boil stew for the sons of the prophets." So what poor people eat during famine is stew. Stew goes a long way. It's not what wealthy people eat. And so whenever you put on a pot, you say, okay, what do we have? We got a few things, but go out and gather some more things. And so similar to the widow having to go gather some oil pots, here God says, okay, through Elisha, set on a large pot, and one of them went out in verse 39 into the field to gather herbs and found a wild vine and gathered from it his lap full of wild gourds and came and cut them up. So he had maybe one poisonous thing, and because he's in desperate search mode, and has one poison thing and all these other things that are edible, and they just cut them all up, put them in there, it's cooking, and then they realize this smells like poison. Okay, that's what happens here. So, verse 40. Not knowing what they were, verse 40 says, they poured out some for the men to eat, but while they were eating of the stew, they cried out, "Oh man of God, there's death in the pot." This sounds so similar to chapter 2, where there was the poisonous or the unuseful water that Elisha was able to cure with a little bit of salt. Here, there's death in the pot, and they could not eat it. And so Elisha is called upon, and he says, okay, so then bring flour. Now, flour normally doesn't take poison out of things, but miraculously it does. And he threw it into the pot and said, okay, pour some out for the men that they may eat. And there was no harm in the pot, a miracle. So God-fearers need him to change the poison into edible food. And it wasn't magical flour, it was a miraculous God behind this. So all of these sons of the prophets realize Elisha is the man of God and realize their faith is growing. Then verse 42, and a man came from Baal Shalisha, bringing the man of God bread of the first fruits, 20 loaves of barley and fresh ears of grain in his sack. Now, don't think large loaves of bread that we get from the grocery store or from Panera. Think the little 5 loaves and 2 fish that the little boys had. So likely biscuit size, cookies or muffins maybe. So small. So this is enough for a couple meals for one person. And then what does Elisha say? So the 20 isn't a lot. Fresh ears of grain, and this man of God likely is a God-fearer, and he's going to provide for Elisha. He doesn't know how many men that Elisha has that he's trying to provide for during this famine. He says, Elisha says to give to the men that they may eat, but his servant says, how can I set this before 100 men? Like you can't divide up little muffins and everybody gets, if there's 20, 100, everybody gets 1/5 of a muffin. You're like, this is not going to feed men. This is way less. It's kind of like when Jesus says to, is it Andrew, with the little boy's lunch, okay, had the people sit down and we're going to feed 5,000 with this little lunch. 100 days' wages isn't going to buy enough bread for everybody to have a bite. Okay, so what is needed here is not changing from one substance to another. It's actually multiplying food that is needed. And verse 43 continues, so he repeated, Elisha says the same thing, give them to the men that they may eat. For thus says Yahweh, they shall eat and have some left. So similar to Jesus feeding of the 4,000, feeding of the 5,000. And so he said it before him. So it required faith. Elisha knew what was going to happen, but his servant didn't. His servant didn't want to look like an idiot. And Elisha says, no, it's not going to be everybody gets a bite. It's going to be everybody's going to have all you can eat buffet and some left. Like, oh, no way. God's going to have to perform a miracle. And he does. Verse 44. So he set it before them, and they ate and had some left, according to the word of Yahweh. So God-fearers need God to provide in the midst of a godless kingdom, and God does provide and grows people's faith. So let's go now to Psalm 34. And I mentioned God-fearers because that's how the chapter started. Psalms like Psalm 34, the godly widow may have been ignorant of this psalm, or she may have known it but didn't experience it until that day in Second Kings 4. But before the miracle, but it became this psalm written by David. She may have access to it. Probably became, like other psalms that talk about her situation, a precious lifelong friend after her God provided for her and the boys. The same could be said for the 100 godly men and the man providing a little food that was multiplied. All of their faith grew in God and his word. And we would probably add in his prophet. Imagine after the best day of the widow and these boys' lives, their very best day when they sold that, they paid off the debt. The guy's not coming to knock at the door anymore. These boys aren't afraid they're going to go off into slavery. And they have money left over to live on as long as until probably these boys can start working and providing for their mom. Imagine this poor widow and her two little boys sitting down and reading this psalm right after God provides for them. Okay. And they're seeing connections of what David wrote a couple hundred years earlier to their life. Okay. So let's look at Psalm 34 and we'll close with this. I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise shall continually be in my mouth. My soul makes its boast in the Lord. Let the humble hear and be glad. Oh, magnify the Lord with me, and let us exalt his name together. I sought the Lord, and he answered me and delivered me from all my fears. Those who look to him are radiant, and their faces shall never be ashamed. This poor man cried, and the Lord heard him and saved him out of all his troubles. The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him and delivers them. O taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the man who takes refuge in him. O fear the Lord, you his saints, for those who fear him have no lack. The young lions suffer want and hunger, but those who seek the Lord lack no good thing. Come, O children, listen to me, and I will teach you the fear of the Lord. What man is there who desires life and loves many days that he may see good? Keep your tongue from evil and your lips from speaking deceit. Turn away from evil and do good. Seek peace and pursue it. The eyes of the Lord are toward the righteous, and his ears toward their cry. The face of the Lord is against those who do evil, to cut off the memory of them from the earth. When the righteous cry for help, the Lord hears and delivers them out of all their troubles. The Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him out of them all. He keeps all his bones, not one of them is broken. Affliction will slay the wicked, and those who hate the righteous will be condemned. The Lord redeems the life of his servants, and none of those who take refuge in him will be condemned.